The Outcast. The twin suns of Sylith shone brightly over the sprawling city, casting long shadows from its towering spires and bustling walkways. Amid the crowd of bustling aliens, each no taller than a human child, one figure stood out. Shara, a towering woman with sleek, silver-blue skin and piercing amber eyes, walked silently, her head held low. She was used to the stares, used to the whispers. Too tall, they murmured. She doesn't belong here. In Sylith culture, height was seen as a flaw, a symbol of imperfection, while others celebrated their petite forms as the pinnacle of beauty and status. Shara's extraordinary height marked her as an outcast. Everywhere she went, the crowds parted, not out of respect, but fear and disdain. Shara tried not to care. She had learned long ago that her worth could not be measured by the opinions of others. Yet some days, their cold gazes pierced deeper than she cared to admit. This day seemed no different. Shara had just finished her work at the power station, a menial job far beneath her capabilities, but the only one the city would grant her. She walked through the crowded market, her footsteps echoing louder than anyone else's. Vendors fell silent as she passed, their customers pulling away from her as if she carried a disease. She ignored them and kept walking until a loud crash snapped her attention. Across the plaza, a human male stood precariously on the edge of a collapsed skyway. The walkway had given way beneath him, leaving him clutching a railing, his feet dangling above the dizzying depths of the city's lower levels. He shouted for help, his voice filled with panic. The Sylithians nearby froze, exchanging uneasy glances. None of them moved to help. The humans were newcomers to this part of the galaxy, and the locals viewed them with suspicion. Shara hesitated. It would be so easy to walk away, to blend into the crowd, and let the others turn a blind eye. Yet something about the desperation in the human's voice tugged at her. Before she could second-guess herself, Shara was moving. Her long strides brought her to the edge of the collapse in moments. The human's eyes widened as she approached, clearly startled by her size. "Hold on," she said firmly, her deep voice carrying over the commotion. Shara knelt and reached down, her long arm easily spanning the gap. "Grab my hand," she commanded. The human hesitated only for a second before latching onto her outstretched hand. With surprising strength, Shara pulled him up in one swift motion, setting him down safely on solid ground. He stumbled, catching his breath. "Thank you," he managed, looking up at her. His gaze wasn't filled with fear or disgust, as she had expected. Instead, it was full of genuine gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite place. "You shouldn't walk on damaged skyways," Shara said bluntly, brushing off her hands. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, offering a weak smile. "I'm James, by the way. James Carter." Shara didn't respond immediately. Around them, the crowd had started to disperse, but not before throwing her disapproving looks. She could hear their whispers. Why would she save a human? Just another reason she doesn't belong here. Shara straightened, towering over James. "You're not from here," she said, her tone more an observation than a question. "No," he admitted. "I'm passing through. Trying to gather supplies for my colony. Things didn't exactly go as planned." Shara crossed her arms. Clearly, James chuckled nervously, scratching the back of his neck. "You saved my life. I owe you." "You owe me nothing," Shara said flatly. She turned to leave, but James stepped in her path. "Wait," he said, his voice earnest. "I mean it. No one else even tried to help me. You did. The least I can do is thank you properly." Shara frowned. "Why would you thank someone like me?" James blinked, confused. "Why wouldn't I? You just saved my life." Shara's frown deepened. She wasn't used to this. Kindness, sincerity. It unsettled her. "Don't expect the rest of my people to be as welcoming," she warned. "I've noticed," James said dryly. He glanced around, his expression growing cautious. "But I still need help. My colony won't survive without the resources I came here for." "Do you?" Do you know anyone who might be willing to guide me? Shara hesitated. Helping the human would only further alienate her from her people. But something about James's determination struck a chord in her. He reminded her of herself, alone in a world that refused to accept him. Finally, she sighed. I might know someone, she said, her voice softening just slightly. James's face lit up. Really? Thank you. You don't know how much this means to me. Shara turned away, her thoughts swirling. She didn't fully understand why she was helping this human. Maybe it was because he looked at her differently than anyone else ever had. Or maybe, deep down, she hoped he might help her see herself differently too. As they walked away from the scene, side by side, the city of Salith buzzed around them. Unbeknownst to either of them, their unlikely partnership was about to spark a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. The human connection. The underground alleys of Salith hummed with faint neon light, the glow casting eerie shadows on the jagged walls. Shara led the way, her tall frame brushing against the occasional low-hanging beam, while James trailed behind, trying to match her stride. The air smelled of metallic rust and dampness, a stark contrast to the gleaming city above. James had never seen anyone move the way Shara did, silent, deliberate, as though every step had a purpose. Her height, which had initially startled him, now seemed an asset in this labyrinth. She could see paths he would have missed, her eyes scanning every corner for danger. So, James broke the silence. Do you always rescue strangers, or am I just special? Shara didn't stop or turn, but he noticed her shoulders stiffen slightly. You were in trouble, she said simply. Well, yeah, but the rest of your people didn't seem to care. That's because you're human, she said, her voice edged with bitterness. And I'm me. James frowned, jogging a little to catch up. What does that mean? You're the only one who actually did something. That should mean you're better than them. Not. Stop, Shara interrupted, finally turning to face him. Her amber eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and James realized just how intimidating she could be when she wanted to. You don't know anything about me. Don't pretend you do. James raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. Touchy subject. Got it. Shara sighed and turned away, her long strides resuming. If you want my help, keep your questions to yourself. For a moment, silence returned between them, broken only by the faint buzz of the neon lights. But James wasn't one to keep quiet for long. I don't get it, he said, his voice quieter this time. Why are you helping me then? You don't seem like the type to care about what anyone thinks. Shara hesitated, her pace slowing. Maybe I don't, she said finally. Or maybe I'm just tired of walking this city alone. James tilted his head, studying her. There was a vulnerability in her voice, hidden behind her tough exterior, and it made him feel a pang of guilt for pushing her earlier. Well, he said with a small smile, if it makes you feel any better, I'm terrible company. To his surprise, Shara let out a soft laugh, a sound so brief he almost thought he imagined it. Where exactly are we going? James asked, eager to keep the moment from slipping away. To someone who can help you get what you're looking for, Shara replied. The outskirts of the city. It's dangerous, but the only place you'll find what you need. Dangerous how? She glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. The kind of dangerous that makes people disappear. James swallowed hard. Great. Love that for us. Shara ignored his sarcasm, her focus shifting to the narrow tunnel ahead. They emerged into a wider chamber filled with alien graffiti and discarded debris. It was a stark contrast to the polished streets above. This is where the outcasts gather, Shara said, her voice low. People like me. James looked around, noticing the scattered figures lurking in the shadows. They were all taller than the average Xelithian, their forms rougher, more angular. Their eyes followed Shara with a mix of wariness and recognition. Wait, James whispered, leaning closer to Shara. Are they like you? They're worse, she said, not meeting his gaze. "Stay close. Don't talk to anyone unless I tell you to." James nodded, his earlier confidence waning as the weight of their surroundings pressed down on him. As they moved deeper into the chamber, a tall figure stepped out from the shadows. He was even taller than Shara, with jagged scars running down his face and arms. His deep-set eyes locked onto Shara, then shifted to James. "Well, well," the figure said, his voice a low growl. "The great Shara returns, and she's brought a pet." James bristled, but Shara placed a firm hand on his shoulder, keeping him from speaking. "We need your help, Torin," she said calmly. "Help?" Torin laughed, the sound echoing off the walls. "You're joking. You disappear for years, and now you come crawling back with a human in tow." Shara's grip on James's shoulder tightened. "I'm not here to argue. He needs something from the outskirts. If you want me to owe you, this is your chance." Torin's eyes gleamed at the word owe. He crossed his arms, his expression shifting to something darker. "And why should I care about some pathetic human?" James stepped forward before he could stop himself. "Because I'm not pathetic," he said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. "And because she's risking her life to help me. Isn't that enough?" The chamber fell silent, every eye turning to James. Torin raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "Brave little thing, aren't you?" Torin said, chuckling. "Fine, I'll help, but don't think it's out of kindness." Shara exhaled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you," she said. As they followed Torin into another tunnel, James glanced up at Shara. "You know," he said, "for someone who doesn't like questions, you sure know how to raise a lot of them." Shara didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at her lips. For the first time, James thought he might be starting to understand her, or at least the parts of her she was willing to let him see. But deep down, he knew their journey was just beginning, and the real danger was yet to come. Forbidden Alliance. The stars above Sylith's outer rim were sharper here, free from the haze of neon lights and pollution that smothered the central city. Shara stood at the edge of a jagged cliff, the wind tugging at her loose cloak. Behind her, James crouched beside a rusted cargo container, carefully rechecking the map on his handheld device. "This can't be right," he muttered, frowning at the glowing screen. "It says the mineral deposit is here, but there's nothing but rocks." Shara didn't look back. Her sharp eyes scanned the barren landscape, searching for movement. "The map's correct," she said. "The deposit's underground. But the question is, how do we get in without being seen?" James glanced around, confused. Seen by who? "There's no one here." Shara's expression darkened as she pointed toward the horizon. James followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. A sleek patrol ship hovered in the distance, its lights sweeping the ground like a predator hunting prey. "Sylith enforcers," Shara said grimly. "They patrol these areas to keep out scavengers and, apparently, humans." James's brow furrowed. "They don't know we're here yet, right?" "Not yet," Shara replied, pulling a small device from her pouch. It emitted a faint hum as she activated it, casting a field of shimmering light around them. "This will hide our heat signatures for now, but once we start digging, they'll notice. They always do." James leaned against the container, his frustration mounting. "This is insane. All this for some stupid rock." Shara turned to face him, her towering frame casting a shadow over his smaller form. "That stupid rock could save your colony, right?" she said, her voice calm but firm. James hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Without it, we're done for." "Then stop complaining and focus," Shara said, her tone leaving no room for argument. For a moment, James said nothing. He wasn't used to taking orders, especially from someone as intimidating as Shara. But there was something in her eyes, a steely determination that mirrored his own. "Fine," he said finally, straightening up. "What's the plan?" Shara knelt and drew a crude map in the dirt with her finger. There's an old access tunnel about half a mile north. It's risky, but it should lead us directly to the deposit. And the enforcers. We move fast and quiet, she said. If we're lucky, they'll pass right over us. James snorted. Great. Love relying on luck. Shara smirked faintly. Welcome to my life. The two set off, keeping low as they made their way across the rocky terrain. The night was eerily silent, broken only by the distant hum of the patrol ship. As they approached the tunnel entrance, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but the darkness revealed nothing. Something wrong? Shara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, James admitted. Just a bad feeling. Shara's eyes narrowed, and she placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him closer to the tunnel. Stay close, she said. They slipped into the tunnel, the air instantly cooler and thick with the scent of damp earth. Shara took the lead, her keen eyesight guiding them through the twisting passage. So, James said after a few minutes, his voice echoing softly, you've done this before. Shara didn't answer immediately. Not exactly, she said finally. James frowned. Then how do you know where we're going? I don't, she admitted, glancing back at him. But if we don't try, you go home empty-handed. And I. She trailed off, her expression unreadable. James studied her for a moment, a question forming in his mind. Before he could ask, a faint rumble shook the tunnel. What was that? He asked, his voice tinged with alarm. Shara held up a hand, motioning for silence. The rumble grew louder, and soon the ground beneath them vibrated with the force of approaching footsteps. Enforcers, she hissed, her voice tense. How did they find us so fast? They always know, Shara muttered. She grabbed James's arm and pulled him deeper into the tunnel. Run. The narrow passage forced them to move single file, their footsteps splashing in the shallow water that pooled along the floor. Behind them, the sound of the enforcer's pursuit grew louder. Faster, Shara urged, her voice carrying over the noise. They rounded a corner and found themselves in a wide chamber. In the center, a cluster of glowing crystals jutted from the ground, their light casting an otherworldly glow. The mineral, James whispered, his awe momentarily overriding his fear. Take what you need, Shara said, positioning herself between James and the tunnel. I'll hold them off. James hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but the look in Shara's eyes silenced his protests. Go, she barked, and he scrambled toward the crystals, his hand shaking as he began to extract them. Shara turned to face the tunnel, her fists clenched. The enforcers' shadows stretched across the walls, their harsh voices barking commands. You can't fight them alone, James called out, glancing back at her. Watch me, Shara said, her voice calm and steady. As the first enforcer stepped into the chamber, Shara moved with a speed and precision that James hadn't thought possible. She was a blur of motion, her towering form using the limited space to her advantage. James worked as quickly as he could, the sound of the struggle echoing around him. Hurry up, Shara shouted, her voice strained. I'm trying, James snapped, yanking the last crystal free. As he turned to run, Shara pushed past him, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. This way, she said, leading him toward a hidden exit. The two burst into the night, the cool air hitting their faces like a slap. Behind them, the tunnel collapsed with a deafening roar, cutting off the enforcer's pursuit. James fell to his knees, clutching the crystals to his chest. You're insane, he panted, looking up at Shara. She smirked, wiping the dust from her face. Maybe, she said, but you're alive. You're welcome. James laughed, a mix of relief and disbelief. I don't know whether to thank you or yell at you. Save it for later, Shara said, scanning the horizon. We're not out of danger yet. As they disappeared into the shadows, the patrol ship hovered above the wreckage, its lights searching for the fugitives. The hunt had only just begun. The escape. The cavern walls echoed with the sound of dripping water and the distant hum of machinery, creating an eerie symphony that wrapped around Shara and James. The tunnel they had escaped through opened into a massive underground chamber, its ceiling lost in the shadows. A faint, unnatural glow emanated from veins of mineral embedded in the walls, casting the space in a ghostly light. James clutched the pack of crystals to his chest, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Tell me," he panted. That was the hard part. Shara, scanning the chamber for exits, snorted. "If that's what you want to believe." Before James could respond, a low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. Dust rained down from the cavern roof, and a series of ancient mechanisms groaned to life. "What now?" James asked, his voice tinged with dread. Shara motioned for him to stay close as the ground began to shift. Large stone platforms rose and fell like a massive alien puzzle, revealing deep pits below. Each pit glowed faintly with a greenish light, the unmistakable shimmer of an energy field crackling within. "Traps," Shara muttered, her voice grim. "Traps," James echoed, his eyes widening. "As in, the fall and die kind." Shara didn't answer. Instead, she crouched low, studying the movement of the platforms. "Stay behind me. Step where I step." "Sure," James said, his voice shaky. "Because I've always been great at following orders under pressure." Shara ignored his sarcasm and leaped onto the first platform, her movements fluid and precise. James hesitated for only a second before following, his footing less sure. The platforms shifted again, forcing Shara to adjust her path. She moved like she belonged there, each step calculated, while James stumbled and nearly lost his balance more than once. "Focus," Shara called back. "Easy for you to say." James gritted his teeth, narrowly avoiding a misstep. "You're not carrying the galaxy's most overpriced backpack." Shara's lips twitched in what might have been amusement, but her focus didn't waver. As they neared the far side of the chamber, the rumbling grew louder, and the platform's movements became more erratic. "They're speeding up," James said, panic creeping into his voice. "Then move faster," Shara snapped. Before they could reach the final platform, a loud clang echoed through the chamber. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a hulking figure clad in sleek, dark armor. The bounty hunter's visor glowed red as he stepped into the room, a plasma weapon humming ominously in his hands. "You've got to be kidding me," James groaned. "Now." The bounty hunter raised his weapon, aiming directly at them. "Hand over the crystals," he ordered, his voice distorted and metallic. Shara stepped in front of James, her towering frame shielding him completely. "Leave now," she said coldly, "or I'll make you regret it." The bounty hunter laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "You? A traitorous outcast? I think not." Before Shara could respond, he fired. A bolt of searing energy streaked toward them, but she was already moving, shoving James aside and leaping to the next platform. The bolt struck the spot where they had just stood, exploding in a shower of sparks. "Run," Shara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. James didn't need to be told twice. He bolted after her, clutching the pack tightly as the platforms continued to shift beneath him. Behind them, the bounty hunter gave chase, his armored bulk barely slowed by the unstable terrain. Shara led the way, her every move an effort to keep James safe. She dodged another blast, the heat singing the air inches from her face. "This guy's persistent," James yelled, his voice strained. Shara grunted in response, her focus entirely on the path ahead. They'd reached the final platform, but the bounty hunter was closing in, his weapon charging for another shot. "Get to the exit," Shara commanded. "What about you?" James demanded, skidding to a halt. "Just go," she barked, her tone leaving no room for argument. James hesitated, his instincts warring with his survival. But the sight of the bounty hunter raising his weapon again spurred him into action. He sprinted toward the cavern's far wall, where a narrow passage beckoned. Shara turned to face the bounty hunter, her fists clenched. "You made a mistake following us," she said, her voice low and dangerous. The bounty hunter smirked behind his visor. Brave words for someone so outmatched. Shara didn't wait for him to fire. She lunged, closing the distance between them with startling speed. The bounty hunter swung his weapon, but she ducked under the blow, landing a powerful punch to his chest. The impact sent him staggering, his armor sparking where her fist had struck. James reached the passage just in time to see Shara grab the bounty hunter's arm, twisting it with a strength that made even him wince. "Come on," he shouted, waving her over. Shara delivered one final blow, knocking the bounty hunter into a pit of crackling energy. His scream echoed through the chamber as the trap claimed him. Breathing heavily, Shara turned and sprinted toward James. The platforms behind her began to collapse, the entire chamber rumbling ominously. "Move," she yelled as she reached him, grabbing his arm and pulling him into the narrow passage just as the chamber gave way. The two of them stumbled to safety, the roar of the collapsing cavern fading behind them. James collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving. "You're insane," he said between gasps. Shara leaned against the opposite wall, a rare smile tugging at her lips. "And you're alive. You're welcome." For a moment, they simply sat there, catching their breath. Then, slowly, James held up the pack of crystals. "I hope these are worth it," he said, managing a weak grin. Shara's expression softened as she looked at him. "They will be," she said, "for both of us." But as they prepared to move again, neither could shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. A new threat. The glow of the crystals cast faint, shifting patterns on the walls of the cavern, but the atmosphere was anything but calm. Shara and James pressed forward, their movements quick and deliberate, their breaths steady despite the adrenaline coursing through their veins. The air was heavier here, tinged with an electric hum that made James's skin prickle. "Are you sure this tunnel leads out?" James asked, clutching the precious crystals to his chest. "No," Shara replied bluntly, her amber eyes scanning the path ahead. James groaned. "Great. Love the confidence." Shara shot him a glance. "Would you rather go back to the collapsing platforms and the energy pits?" "Fair point," James muttered, falling silent. They continued deeper into the passage, the walls narrowing until they had to walk single file. Shara moved with the grace of someone who had been in situations like this before, while James stumbled slightly, his focus split between keeping his balance and holding onto the pack. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the crystals and the occasional sound of dripping water. It was almost peaceful, until they heard the footsteps. Shara froze, her hand shooting up to stop James. Her keen hearing had picked up the faint, deliberate rhythm long before James noticed. "What is it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Quiet," Shara hissed, her head tilting slightly as she strained to listen. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the tunnel with an unhurried confidence. Whoever, or whatever, was coming didn't feel the need to hide. James's grip on the crystals tightened. "Please tell me that's not another enforcer." Shara's expression darkened. "Worse." From the shadows ahead, a figure emerged. The bounty hunter's armor was scratched and scorched from their earlier encounter, but his glowing visor was intact, casting a menacing red light in the dim tunnel. "You really thought you'd lost me," he said, his voice a low metallic growl. James took an involuntary step back. "You've got to be kidding me. How is he still alive?" Shara didn't answer. Her focus was entirely on the bounty hunter, her stance shifting subtly as she prepared for a fight. "I'll give you one chance," the bounty hunter said, leveling his weapon at them. "Hand over the crystals, and I'll let the human live." Shara's eyes narrowed. "And me?" The bounty hunter chuckled darkly. You're coming back to the council. Alive or in pieces, they didn't specify." James's heart pounded as he glanced between Shara and the bounty hunter. "This feels like a bad time to point out how unfair this fight is," he whispered. Shara didn't reply. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her towering frame seeming even more imposing in the tight confines of the tunnel. "You should have stayed in that pit," she said, her voice low and steady. The bounty hunter raised his weapon, but Shara was faster. In an instant, she lunged, her movements a blur in the confined space. The shot from his weapon went wide, striking the tunnel wall and sending a shower of sparks raining down. James ducked, clutching the crystals as the two giants clashed. The sound of metal on flesh and the grunt of effort filled the air as Shara and the bounty hunter traded blows. Despite her size, Shara moved with incredible speed, dodging the hunter's strikes and landing precise hits that echoed through the tunnel. But the bounty hunter was no ordinary opponent. His armor absorbed much of Shara's blows, and his strength rivaled hers. James's mind raced. He knew he was no match for the bounty hunter, but he couldn't just stand there. His eyes darted around, searching for anything that could tip the odds in their favor. Then he saw it, a cluster of loose rocks above the bounty hunter, barely held in place by the cracked ceiling. "Shara," James yelled, pointing upward. She glanced at him, then at the rocks, understanding immediately. With a sudden burst of strength, she delivered a powerful kick to the bounty hunter's chest, sending him staggering backward directly under the unstable ceiling. "Now," she shouted. James didn't hesitate. He hurled one of the smaller crystals at the cluster of rocks, the impact sending the entire section crashing down. The bounty hunter had no time to react. The rocks buried him in an instant, the sound of the collapse echoing through the tunnel. For a moment, there was silence. James stood frozen, his chest heaving as he stared at the pile of rubble. Did that actually work? Shara leaned against the tunnel wall, catching her breath. For now, James looked at her, his expression a mix of awe and exhaustion. "You're unbelievable, you know that." Shara smirked, wiping the streak of dirt from her face. "And you're lucky I'm on your side." They didn't wait to see if the bounty hunter would claw his way out again. Shara motioned for James to follow, and the two of them pressed on, their pace quickening. As they disappeared deeper into the tunnels, the faint glow of the crystals lighting their way, neither of them noticed the faint flicker of red light emanating from beneath the rubble. The bounty hunter wasn't finished yet. Redemption. The towering gates of Salith loomed ahead, their metallic surface shimmering faintly under the pale light of the twin moons. Shara and James crouched in the shadows of a crumbling wall, their breaths slow and measured. The air was tense, thick with the unspoken weight of what lay ahead. "You're sure about this?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Shara didn't look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the gates, her expression unreadable. "No," she admitted, "but it's the only way." James frowned, clutching the bag of crystals tightly. "We could just leave. Forget the council, forget the city. Find another way." Shara finally turned to him, her amber eyes gleaming with determination. "Running won't fix anything. If we don't stand up to them, they'll keep hunting us. Hunting you." James hesitated. He'd seen Shara's strength, her resilience, but he also knew how much she'd suffered under the weight of her people's judgment. "You're risking everything," he said quietly. "I already lost everything," Shara replied. "This isn't just about me anymore." Before James could respond, the faint hum of a patrol ship reached their ears. Shara tensed, her hand instinctively moving to the blade strapped to her hip. "They're expecting us," she said. "Fantastic," James muttered. "Love walking into a trap." Shara shot him a look, a flicker of amusement breaking through her seriousness. "Stay close. Let me handle the council." James swallowed hard and nodded. "Got it. Be tall, be terrifying. Let you do the talking." With a deep breath, Shara stepped out of the shadows and strode toward the gates. Her towering frame cast a long shadow across the ground, her every step deliberate and unyielding. James followed closely, his smaller form dwarfed by her presence. The gates groaned open as they approached, revealing a group of Sylith enforcers flanking the council members. The council stood in a semicircle, their ornate robes and delicate features a stark contrast to the grim, armored enforcers. At the center of the council stood Elder Nixus, a frail but imposing figure whose piercing gaze landed on Shara. "Shara," Nixus said, her voice cold and sharp, "the Outcast returns, and with a human in tow, no less." Shara stopped a few paces away, her stance unwavering. "I'm here to end this," she said firmly. Nixus raised an eyebrow. "And what? Your rebellion? Your betrayal of our laws? Your hatred?" Shara shot back, her voice echoing through the courtyard. "Your fear of anything different. I won't let you use me, or him, as scapegoats for your weakness." Murmurs rippled through the crowd of onlookers that had gathered behind the council. James glanced around nervously, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. "You dare to lecture us?" Nixus hissed. "You, who defy our traditions and brought shame to your lineage." Shara took a step forward, her amber eyes blazing. "I didn't bring shame. You did, by turning your backs on anyone who doesn't fit your narrow idea of perfection." The murmurs grew louder, uncertainty flickering across the faces of the onlookers. Nix's expression darkened. "Enough. You will surrender yourself and the human, or face the consequences." Shara stood tall, her voice unwavering. "No, I'm done running. If you want a fight, I'll give you one. But know this, your fear won't win. Not this time." Before Nixus could respond, a voice called out from the crowd. "She's right." All heads turned as a young Silithian stepped forward, their small frame trembling but their voice steady. "She saved me once, years ago, when no one else would. She's not a traitor, she's a hero." Another voice joined in. "She helped rebuild the lower districts after the floods. Where was the council then?" The murmurs turned into shouts, the crowd rallying around Shara. Nixus's composure cracked, her voice rising in desperation. "Silence. This is treason." James stepped forward, emboldened by the growing support. "You call it treason, but all I see is someone brave enough to stand against your cruelty. Maybe it's time your people had someone like her leading them." Shara glanced at James, surprise flashing across her face. He shrugged, giving her a small, defiant grin. Nix's expression twisted with rage, but before she could speak, the enforcers hesitated, their ranks wavering. The tide was turning, and even the council could feel it. Shara took one final step forward, her voice carrying over the noise. "You don't have to fear me anymore," she said. "But if you try to hurt him, or anyone else like him, you'll wish you had." The courtyard fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one by one, the onlookers began to cheer. The sound grew louder, drowning out Nix's protests. James looked up at Shara, a mix of awe and pride in his eyes. "You did it," he said. Shara allowed herself a small smile, though her gaze remained sharp. "It's not over yet," she said quietly. As the crowd continued to rally around her, Shara knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. But for the first time in years, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. A new beginning. The stars above Sylith's horizon stretched like endless ribbons of light, untouched and eternal. Shara stood at the edge of the launch platform, her towering frame outlined against the shimmering night. The city behind her was alive with change, a murmur of voices, a wave of defiance against the council's oppressive rule. James leaned against the ship's hull, the crystals safely stored in the cargo hold. His hands were smeared with grease from a final systems check, but his face carried an expression of quiet satisfaction. "You really shook them up back there," he said, looking over at Shara. "They needed to be shaken." Shara replied, her voice calm but firm. The memory of the crowd chanting her name still felt surreal. For years, she had been an outcast, a shadow on the fringes of society. Now she was something else entirely. A symbol of resistance, a beacon for those who had been silenced. "You think they'll actually change?" James asked, his tone tinged with skepticism. Shara turned to him, her amber eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Not overnight," she admitted. "But it's a start. They've seen what's possible. They'll fight for it now." James nodded, pushing off the hull and crossing the platform to stand beside her. "And you? Are you going to stay and lead the fight?" Shara's gaze shifted back to the city. For a moment, she didn't answer. "No," she said finally. "My fight isn't here anymore." James raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? You're kind of their hero now." Shara gave a small wry smile. "They don't need a hero. They need to find their own strength. Besides," she glanced at him, her expression softening, "you're still carrying those crystals like your life depends on it. Your colony needs them. And you." "And us," James corrected, his voice steady. Shara's smile widened slightly, and she inclined her head. "Us, then." The sound of footsteps interrupted them, and they turned to see a small group of Xalithians approaching. Among them was the young one who had spoken up during the confrontation with the council. "We wanted to say goodbye," the young Xalithian said, their voice trembling slightly with emotion. "And thank you." Shara knelt, bringing herself closer to their level. "The fight isn't over," she said gently. "You have to keep pushing. Don't let them go back to their old ways." The young one nodded fiercely. "We won't. You've shown us what's possible." Another Xalithian stepped forward, holding out a small, intricately carved pendant. "Take this," they said, "as a reminder of what you've done here, of who you are." Shara hesitated for a moment before accepting the pendant, her fingers brushing against its cool surface. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter than usual. As the group stepped back, Shara rose to her full height, her gaze meeting James'. "Time to go," she said. James gave a mock salute. "Captain's orders." They boarded the ship, its engines humming to life. Shara took the co-pilot's seat beside James, her movements confident despite the unfamiliar controls. As the ship lifted off, the city of Salith grew smaller beneath them, its lights merging into a single brilliant glow. "Think they'll be okay?" James asked, his hand steady on the controls. "They'll figure it out," Shara replied. The stars stretched out before them, vast and full of possibilities. For the first time in years, Shara felt a sense of freedom she couldn't quite put into words. James glanced at her, a grin tugging at his lips. "So, what's next for the galaxy's tallest rebel?" Shara leaned back in her seat, her expression thoughtful. "We find your colony. Deliver those crystals. After that, who knows?" James chuckled. "Adventure, then." "Adventure," Shara agreed, her voice carrying a rare note of hope. As their ship disappeared into the starlit expanse, the city of Salith faded into memory. But for Shara and James, their journey was just beginning. And this time, they would face the galaxy together.